by Kenneth H. Thomas, Jr. I'm Penny Cliff, Education Specialist here at the Georgia Archives. We're really glad that you've joined us. Our presenter has written the weekly genealogy column in the Sunday Atlanta Journal-Constitution for almost 45 years. This is the longest running genealogy column in the United States, quite an accomplishment. He is a frequent lecturer on history and genealogy, especially on DNA testing for genealogical research. An 8th generation Georgian, Ken is a native of Columbus and graduated from Emory University. While in England for his final 2 years of service in the United States Air Force, he became familiar with London and many of the places from which the original Georgia settlers came. Now, if you have friends or family who aren't able to view this webinar at this time, they can still enjoy the presentation, as it will be uploaded to the Georgia Archives YouTube channel early next week. You may ask Ken any questions in the chat at the end of the presentation. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you, Penny. I wanted to get on the main screen. There we go. As Penny mentioned, I spent my last 2 years of the Air Force in England and really got to enjoy London quite a bit. In doing this presentation, one of my goals, I don't think the clicker is working, Alex. Something has happened here. There we go. When you talk about the founding of Georgia, the charter was created in 1732, and that's when the Georgia Trustees got organized officially by the government to create a new colony called Georgia. The actual term Georgia had been vetted around quite a bit by the group of trustees in their earlier membership groups they belonged to. The trustees included James Oglethorpe, who's considered the founder of Georgia and who came with the first group of colonists in 1732-33.
Excuse me, Ken?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, could you talk louder?
I got mine on total volume here. Can everybody hear me better now? I'm talking as loud as I can. The men that were members of the Georgia Trustees focused on several issues. One was creating filling in the geographical void between South Carolina and Florida. And of course, Georgia was really carved out of the South Carolina colony. Offer a new outlet for the unfortunate poor of London, which was their main focus. Indoctrinate the settlers to grow crops and products to help England's various efforts, including silk, and galvanize the men who owned the trustees to do more good deeds. That was one of their major causes in life. And the idea of the new colony had to be vetted to the king and to Parliament to get their approval. And this took several years. General Oglethorpe, this is a picture of him here. He lived downtown London right near the Houses of Parliament, which is of course right behind Westminster Abbey still today. And his mother, this is his mother's obituary in the London paper of 1732. One of the reasons Oglethorpe was able to come to Georgia with the original group as the only trustee to come to Georgia was that his mother passed away in June of 1732, right before the Georgia Trustees got organized and started working on vetting and interviewing people to come over to the new colony. So his mother was buried right downtown London at St. James's Church, very close to Westminster Abbey. The Georgia Charter, like I said, finally got the King's final approval and the Privy Seal on 9 June 1732. And the charter allowed 21 men to be the trustees. They're all named in the charter. The charter is quite lengthy. And several of the ideas in the charter were to work with the noble, the worthy poor, or however they specified the poor people that needed to be given a better chance in life, and they had to volunteer and agree to come to Georgia and follow the trustees' policies. The colony was, of course, named for King George II, who was the king at that time. And the original charter, this is how Georgia would have looked if they had gone through with the boundaries and we'd kept them, went all the way to the Pacific Ocean, which they called the South Seas at that time in the charter. But this is just a stylized view of what Georgia would have looked like. The original boundary did not go down to the Florida line. That was much later when that was worked out. The trustees, several of the names, if you're familiar with Savannah, Georgia, which was the original city, a number of the names of the trustees were used in some of the streets and the various squares in Savannah and things like that. The first meeting of the trustees was July 20th, 1732. So they managed to pull together a colony and settlers and all within 4 months so they could leave in November, come to Georgia. This is what appeared in one of the London papers. It looks like on my screen some of the bottom is cut off, but there was a lot of publicity about the colony of Georgia, and so people were well aware, and that's how different people agreed to get to the trustees' offices. They had to presumably walk there, maybe take some kind of transportation from the greater London area to get to the trustees' office, which is down right next to the Houses of Parliament, very close to where like Big Ben is today, because that was added later when they rebuilt the Houses of Parliament in the 1830s. But you'll notice what I've itemized here. The trustees are to facilitate the settling of these people in Georgia under a regular form of government, grant lands there to them and their heirs forever, and to have them instructed and encouraged in the raising of raw silk, wine, flax, hemp, and other gross materials useful to the trade of England. And one of the ideas was not to compete with what was already going on, but to do things that would help the British economy. You notice at the top they say in this abstract that British subjects that are misfortunes rendered incapable of supporting themselves and their families here, and to give them a safe and comfortable retreat to foreigners. They were real anxious to help the Salzburgers who were in Germany coming out of persecution in Salzburg, Austria. And there are several different German-speaking groups that did come over later on. In the first meeting was announced in the newspaper too, effective July 20th, 1732, to go to the trustees' office. And you notice at the bottom their offices of the house in the Palace Court near the Houses of Lords in Westminster. So it's still right down in the same area they were always located in. And one interesting thing is that General Oglethorpe and his mother lived right there as well. So General Oglethorpe only really had to go across the street to the trustees' meeting room, a place they rented. The records we have related to the trustees and the founding of Georgia come from the Earl of Egmont, who started off as John Percival, and he was created an earl by the king within the first few months of the Georgia colony getting organized. He has kept a great diary that was later published in England, and abstracts of that have been reprinted here, the parts that deal with the founding of Georgia. The Colonial Records of Georgia project included the trustees' minutes starting in 1904 when they were published by the state of Georgia, and the man had been governor, Candler, became the Secretary of State, and he got the trustees' minutes published as part of this long series, the Colonial Records of Georgia, which are at many libraries and of course at the state archives. And out of his work, he had compiled the list of the early settlers, and it was part of some documents of his material bought by the University of Georgia in the 1940s. In 1949, Dr. Coulter and Mr. Say abstracted his Egmont's records of the settlers and all the details about them. He kept, I'm going to show you a picture in a minute of the original, but he kept meticulous records, and that's how we know who was coming over. And in the first group, he wrote down their age, their occupation, their wife's name, her age, and the children. So that's how we know in the first shipload of people, more data about them to research. This is downtown London. On the left is an older picture around Westminster Abbey and the Houses of Parliament. And you'll see where it says Old Palace Yard, and that's where the trustees met. Their office was right off Old Palace Yard. And on the right hand, a more modern picture of London, you'll see this big X, and that's where General Oglethorpe lived. His mother had lived till she died, but that's all right down in the same general vicinity. I wasn't able to pick a spot on that map because things have changed down there, but it's essentially all very close together. And when General Oglethorpe finally married after he left the Georgia colony in the 1740s, he married at St. Margaret's Church, which is right next to Westminster Abbey. It's a separate religious body there. This is how the trustees, back in those days, you had to send a notice out. So this is how the trustees notified each other. This is a much later version. The citation is cut off on my screen, but there's a citation at the bottom. It's on microfilm at the archives. But this is how they notified the Earl of Egmont to come to the meeting a little bit later in the trustees' lifetime. But this is his invitation to the anniversary meeting. They were real big every year of having an anniversary of the meeting of the trustees of Georgia. And you'll notice on this one, they were meeting at St. Margaret's Church, which, as I said before, was right next to Westminster Abbey. And they were going to adjourn to Horn's Tavern. And just like today, you had to pay the messenger 5 shillings to pay ahead of time for your supper. So they weren't letting even these wealthy trustees get away with not paying for their dinner ahead of time. On the left is a postcard that I sent from London the first weekend I visited there. In fact, it was actually 51 years ago this weekend. And that just shows you an arrow where St. Margaret's Church is. And of course, Westminster Abbey is right to the left of it in the picture. So who were the first 114 settlers? They applied to go to Georgia. They had to come to the trustees' office to be interviewed. The trustees met once a week, sometime in the afternoon. They had a separate type of meeting once a month for like an executive committee. The people that were coming in were the worthy poor. They were Protestants. That was one of the criteria. You had to be a Protestant or not a Catholic to come to Georgia. They were not allowing Catholics in. That was a huge issue at this time. And they found one man one time that was a Catholic that somehow snuck into Georgia, and they booted him out. Most of these people were from London, the greater London area, because you had to get to the trustee's office. And so we now know that I've identified that everybody I've identified has been from the greater London area. There were 114, they referred to them on the charity. But when you think about 114 people, that's not all grown people. There were 44 grown men, including the servants. Some people were bringing servants over. There were 20 women, including servants, and then were children. So you got 44 adult men. Plus, there were 7 other men who we know came and paid their own way on the ship. That's slowly been totally forgotten, that there were 7 other people on board. We know their names. Plus the Reverend Herbert, who was coming to be the minister to the colony, and then General Oglethorpe himself. So we know there were 123 people coming over for the colony, plus the crew of the boat. They had to sign an agreement to go to Georgia. They had to follow some rules. And if you were a servant, when you finished your period of servitude, you could get some land yourself. The settlers were expected to farm, yet most of these knew nothing about farming. They were city folk. One person observed that some people were worthless in England and they were worthless in America. A lot of people deserted the colony in the first year. I'll show you some of the things they were faced with when they got there. Many died within the first year, and many ran away to South Carolina, which was, of course, extremely close by. Out of the 114 original settlers, we had mentioned the men, the women, and the children, and the servants. The oldest man to come over was 55, Mr. Sims, and the youngest was a boy born, George Warren, who was born on board the ship. They had had 2 children to die on the way over. Several families brought 4 or 5 children with them. It's amazing that people were that brave or that desperate to get on board in London in November and journey for 2 months to come to Georgia with children, knowing they would never get back to England and they were giving up everything, but they were that desperate. This little kid that was born did survive. The 2 that were born on board the ship had to be buried at sea. And I don't think I knew that till I read some stuff the other day, that they had to, as anyone that dies at sea, they had to bury him at sea. Of the 28 men who were married with women, with a wife and or children, they're the ones you can research because you've got the records we'll show you from London of the parish records, which are now online at ancestry.com and other sites. So out of the 28 men, I've been able to research 13 of those families, or half of them, have been found and researched so far in the London record. Some people had 2 common names. The single men, you really can't research them because you don't have any data, because other than their birth record, there'd be no parish record because they didn't marry at that time. Or their name is, again, just too common right now. We may find them later, but so far I haven't found everybody. The records that have come to light in the last 15 years from Ancestry.com, which is a database, a subscription site, of course, and not everybody has the world part of Ancestry that covers the British records. The database is somewhat tricky. The spelling of the name, whether you research London, Greater London, or Westminster, which was the other legal entity, downtown London, is divided into at least two legal entities. Two archives are involved, the London Metropolitan Archive or the Westminster Metropolitan Archives, two city governments, and two sets of records. And we're only looking at the parish records of baptisms, marriages, and burials. If the churches had other records, those are not online that I've been able to find. It does show you, I'll show you in a minute, it does lead us to the original digitized parish records. You need to see the original documents. And because the original trustees records from the Earl of Egmont gave the age of the passengers and their spouse and the children, you can sort of sort out the families and find the ones that match those records. The indexes can be tricky. Sometimes a name could be garbled. Somebody, whoever indexed it on behalf of Ancestry, might have not read the name properly, and so forth. But it verifies to me that the first colonists to Georgia were all from the greater London area. We use newspapers as well, and the one I use for most of the stuff here is newspaperarchive.com, because the trustees published 2 notices for creditors to be sure they weren't sending anybody to Georgia that owed money. And we found 2 of those. They were found a long time ago and they've been rediscovered, but the digitization missed one whole newspaper. I just found that by going page by page. When you had to leave England, you got vetted by the trustees. You found their way to their office. You had, if you got accepted, you had to sign an agreement. I don't have a copy of the agreement. It may exist, but I have not seen it. You had to pack up. You could take some luggage with you. We know that because they had a separate ship full of all that kind of stuff. You had to pay your debts. You told everybody goodbye. I'm not sure where they got on board. I know where they left from at Gravesend, which I'll show you in a map in a minute. I'm not sure where they actually got on board with the Thames River going right through London. There were plenty of places, if they could, board people, take them on a smaller ship to the ship they were leaving on. Some agreed to be local city officers, like bailiff, magistrate. They did all that before they went to England, so they had a meeting with the trustees. And when this first ship left, the trustees went to the town of Gravesend to see them off. So they went on board the boat and had a prayer, and that's recorded in the trustees' minutes. So they were really concerned with making sure everybody was happy, got on board, and were settled to go. The first embarkation was around November the 17th, 1732. The weather prevented them leaving immediately, so they were sort of stuck up the river a bit. Like I said, we researched the settlers. We found the ones with the more unusual names. Egmont, the Earl of Egmont, listed some real good data on people. I only have researchers sample them. And I'll show you some of the research data that I found, but we have the families of Richard Cannon and his family. I think he had 4 or 5 children with him. The Greenfield twins, Noble Jones, who's very prominent in Savannah after he got to Georgia, and his descendants are very prominent in Savannah today, the Barrow family. Thomas Millage, whose grandson was John Millage, the governor of Georgia, and Milledgeville's named for that family. The Thibault family is a Huguenot family, and then Charles Tondy of the Tondy family in Savannah. There's been a book written on them. Here's some of the occupations. Now, the trustees were real big on getting different occupations to come over. They mostly wanted sawyers or carpenters who could build some of the houses, but they had an apothecary, a basket maker. Some of the people that became the leaders of the colony had occupations that don't sound like you would become a leader. Mr. Causton, who was very controversial, but he was a calico printer, as was other members of his in-laws. Cider maker, you needed some cider for sure. Various versions of cloth and hemp and flax and things like that. One man identified as a farmer. One man was a doctor, Mr. William Cox, and he died. He was the first person to die in the colony. So it's not good when you have the first person to die as the doctor. That caused immense problems. One man was a merchant. We have one military guy, Francis Scott, and he was considered a sort of broken down military guy, but he was useful when he got there. He had 2 wig makers. I'm not sure how useful making a wig would be when you got to the frontier of Georgia, but I guess they had other things they could do. There were silk growers that came from Italy. And anyway, you see the list. There was an upholsterer, several people involved with vines and vintners. One man identified a writer, but nobody was a teacher. I thought it was interesting with all these children coming, there was nobody identified as a teacher. because we don't have any occupations listed for the women, so many of the women could have filled in other things that were needed there during the colony, but they didn't identify any of the women's occupation other than just being white. So the original settlers on the first ship, the Anne, out of those 44, we've identified a number of parishes through these marriage records, baptismal records, and I've just listed some of the churches here. London has a zillion churches, and even though they bombed a lot of them during World War II, there's still a zillion churches around, and the records survived. There's always a chance that one of the people we can't find, maybe they were in the records that were lost, but I didn't find any gap in the records that I could tell. But I list here some of the churches that were there, and then below the line, in this next list, I'm going to show you from the 1733 vetting of the boat coming that summer, 1733. They gave those people's addresses, so we know some of the churches they belonged to because we know where they lived in London, and we have some of their parish records as well. The Greenfield twins. Sarah Greenfield was one of the ladies that came over. She was a twin, the only twin that's listed, and she became supposedly the mother of Governor Elbert, Samuel Elbert, one of the governors in the late 1700s in Georgia. And this is her baptismal record from this very odd named church, St. John of Wapping, Tower Hamlets. But a number of the settlers came from this Tower Hamlets area of London. And this just shows you the original parish record in 1717 of her and her brother Charles' baptisms. This is Noble Jones, who later was in Savannah as a prominent person. This is his baptism in 1702, mainly because his name is so unusual. He was baptized at St. Martin's Ventry Church, which is an unusual church. And you can see, you got to remember the calendar back then, they changed to the new year in March. So some of the dates are maybe 1 year off from what you normally think about if they were born, anything happened before the middle of March. You know, Georgia was founded, the settlers arrived in Savannah and the calendar of the day was 1 February 1732, but it was converted when the calendar changed to 12 February 1733. And they call that old style and new style with the calendar. We were able to find Noble Jones's marriage record in Savannah, in London. This is St. Margaret's, Westminster, the same church I mentioned earlier, next door to Westminster Abbey. And remember, he was a carpenter. He married a woman named Sarah Heck, and the British records, if they're full, they give the parish, the original parish of both members that are getting married. So the spouse, Sarah, was from St. James, Westminster, the same church where Oglethorpe's mother was buried. This is a marriage allegation. You don't find this on everybody, but I found it on them. And their son, Noble Wimberley Jones, equally prominent later in Savannah in the later 18th century. This is his birth record, and I don't think we ever had this before. It's certainly not in the Dictionary of Georgia Biography or the online New Georgia Encyclopedia. This is his birth record in 1731-32. So he was an infant when he came to Georgia, less than a year later. Again, his date of birth was adjusted due to the being born before the March change. He was born in a different church, so that shows the parents moved around. He was born on the south side of the Thames at Lambeth, which is where the Archbishop of Canterbury's headquarters is. Charles Tondy. Tondy was a Huguenot, a French Huguenot family. And a friend of mine, Carl Weeks of Savannah, has written a book about the Tondys, his book on Peter Tondy. And this is just the Huguenot church, French Protestant, where his birth, Charles Tondy, the older brother's birth, shows up. You see that in the arrow I pointed out there. The Huguenot Society of London had found some of this material, but we now have seen the original, gives not only his birth date, but his baptismal date. And for some reason, the other Tondy boy didn't show up, but he may be there. Their mother's death should show up, but it was not indexed. That just shows you that if you go back through these records, you may find more material, but you may have to go page by page. But it is written in English, even though they were French. I think it's in English. Now, this is something I found just by searching the internet. Daniel Thibault, who has Georgia descendants. This is a write-up done about him in the Huguenot Herald, showing some of the records about him from the EGMONT manuscripts and in the church that he belonged to. But that just shows you there's more stuff out there. You need to always go back on any project and research. Just doing a Google search turned up a lot of this material. There's no secret place to look for this except just going to Ancestry and just doing regular genealogy research. Here's the little map I found showing London and then Gravesend, further down the Thames River, is where they left from. That's the same place where Pocahontas had died a good bit 100 years earlier in 1617. I'm not sure why she was there, but that's where she was when she died and is buried there. But that's how far it was from London to the actual point where the ship left at Gravesend. Now this is what Savannah was going to be looking like. This was the map the plan of the city that Peter Gordon drew. It's very famous. It's been reprinted a zillion times. It shows the way the city was going to be laid out. It's very similar to a part of London called Hanover Square, which is being developed there during the Hanoverian era of London. And when I saw Savannah for the first time, which was after I'd been to, I actually went to London before I went to Savannah. And so when I started roaming around Savannah, I realized how much it looked like the parts of London that I remembered when I was over there in the Air Force and walked around quite a bit. So it wasn't a shock to me to see how it linked to London's building plan they were using in London in the 1730s. But Oglethorpe had worked all this out, and each one of the settlers was going to get around 50 acres. You got a town lot, and then further away you had a garden plot, and then further away you got a farm lot. So all your land wasn't all connected together. And this is what they were supposed to have there when they mentioned. Notice the forest. Notice that this is carved out of the forest, but this is what they were going to do. This is what it looked like out there, just a plain field. And Mr. Causton writes his wife, who's back in London, when she's getting ready to come over to join him. He just says, we arrived at night. They had gone to Charleston first, then they moved down the river to Port Royal, South Carolina. They got off the big boat from London. The big boat from London didn't make it all the way to Savannah. Couldn't do the channels. So they got off, they put in some barracks. They freshened up, had some good food. And then in the dark of night, they arrived in Savannah in 6 smaller craft. Obviously, someone had to be paddling those craft. And this is what they got to see. So it's a big shock to come from London or having just been to Charleston. And all of a sudden you arrive, and Oglethorpe had an advance party. They had put up some tents. So these people had to come. And now think about poor Ms. Millage arriving with 5 children. And Mrs. Warren arriving with 5 children and a 3-week-old infant. This is what they were faced with. So it was quite a shock. This is what the original book looks like, the Earl of Egmont kept, put together about the early settlers. He did this up until 1741 when he retired. This is now at the University of Georgia. It's now been digitized. So see, you can do all this research. I haven't left home to do this, folks, in the last 6 months. I've just had the great pleasure of having the books or purchasing more books and then finding out what the University of Georgia is now digitized. So the Earl of Egmont's manuscript has been digitized. The citation is on the bottom of the screen, which is covered up on my screen. But this is the writing of the noble Jones family, and at the top he lists the people, their ages, and occupations. And at the bottom are his footnotes. And this is where over the years that he did all this, he commented about people and how he assembled this without an Excel spreadsheet. Who knows? But when the book was published in 1949, Dr. Coulter and Mr. Say and their staff assembled all this, reversed the way that Egmont did it, and then numbered each person. And so that's how they come up with the full set of Georgia's settlers. They were more concerned, the Earl of Egmont and the Georgia team, the trustees, were concerned with who they paid for on the charity. They kept careful records, and then they also listed the other people that came over, joined the colony, who were not paid to come over, and including somebody that was born. If you were born after the family got here, then you're just listed as another settler because they didn't pay your way because you came in another manner. This is sort of a chart I was putting together, the ships that came over, and of course they didn't have full ships all the time. So the first settlers came over. They were real careful to comment on the Brits that were there, 109, 5 foreigners, and then we know 9 other people came with them, plus the ship's crew. And you follow down the list, the Tondees came over on really the second ship in January of 33. And then further down here, I've got these orange circles. Those are the two ships that in June and September of 1733 that were vetted in the newspaper, where the trustees listed all the people coming over. I'll show you that in a minute, to make sure their creditors weren't left holding the bag. I don't know how much is covered up on y'all's screen, but at the very bottom we have a total of, they had 355 British and 62 foreigners. This is all in the first year of 1733. In July 13th of 33, the Jewish people arrived unannounced and without permission. And Oglethorpe was in a quandary. There's quite a bit of controversy that went on because the trustees didn't give the Jewish people permission to come over. They also came from London, but they were mostly German and Portuguese. They added 42 new colonists, but the main thing is they had a doctor with them. And the doctor came right at the right time when people were dying from various things in the summer of 1733. So they let the Jewish people stay because of the doctor, Dr. Samuel Nunez. And later, Oglethorpe was able to get permission to let them stay. But the trustees have it in their minutes. They were quite upset that people arrived without getting permission. I think you want to say the trustees are control freaks. Is not too hard to say. This is the newspaper notice for June of 1733. Notice for everyone there, and they just list the men on this one. You have the various street addresses. You see the one man I've marked was actually at Gravesend, Kent. That's where the ship was leaving from, the final point. So that about the farthest away from downtown London, but you see you've got other addresses, Soho, Southwark is on the south side of the Thames. Notice one man's from a workhouse. So he was probably pretty down on his luck because the workhouse was really down on the economic level. Anyway, this is very interesting to have a list, but I've used this list to point out in London where all these men on this June 33 boat were from. These are just the red dots I put on this map of London, current map. The big T at the bottom is where the trustees were settled. That's where the offices were. And you can see how far these men had to come to be interviewed by the trustees, to be vetted, to come over on the trustees' expense. And this is just part of London. I wasn't able to do the whole map, and if we ever get to do this in person sometime, I will have a bigger map to show more. But to the right of the map, to the east, were more of the working class areas of London, where people, and to the left of the map is, of course, now where Buckingham Palace is and Kensington Palace, but there were people from some of those other areas. Again, everybody had to be down on their luck to be able to apply to the trustees and whatever the criteria. At the end of this talk, we're going to ask people what their questions would have been if you had been on the trustees board and you had to interview these men, and what was going to happen, what you thought they ought to be qualified for, what were their good points about coming to Georgia. This is the other half of that first notice. The man on the left, Daniel Preston, I marked him because the poor guy got to the boat and I think he fell off the ship. Anyway, he didn't get to Georgia. Something happened to him, and he mentioned in the trustees' minutes that Daniel Preston met some fate and did not make it. In August of 33, they had a second list in the paper. This was in the trustees' minutes that were going to vet everybody. These are the only two lists that I've ever found, and the only two lists that we have records of anybody finding. So the trustees probably didn't continue to do this, vetting all the names. Maybe they decided it was pointless. But over here on the right, we mentioned Robert Smith. So they vet this in the paper, 23 August 1733, and I found that it only ran, whereas today we might publish a legal notice 3 or 4 times. This ran only one time. And this was the one that wasn't digitized. I had to find it from knowing that someone had found it 50 years ago, so I knew it was there. But Mr. Smith, the man he owed money to came and got him, and they pulled him off the boat. So the trustees were insistent that nobody was going to go that owed anyone. But if you look at the addresses here, again, they're all over the London area, Marylebone Street, Carnaby Street. One man brought his apprentice with him, which means his servant. One lady was Frances Sykes, right above Mr. Smith. She was coming to join her son-in-law and her daughter, of course. And he says her son-in-law, Robert Clark, had come over in November of 32. This does link a lot of the women that were coming to join their spouses. in the whole picture of this, there are several other families that are joining each other. So it showed the women were coming. They don't list the addresses for the people that were joining someone, but everyone else, they do leave a street or community. The London papers carried the news of the Georgia colony quite a lot. Everybody had to be aware of this if you read the paper. There were a lot of different London newspapers. This is the London Evening Post, the same one that had the 2 ads about the people coming over. This must have been the favorite paper of the trustees. This whole front page is covering the news. They published Oglethorpe's arrival and letters he wrote back. The trustees did mention that, you know, they paid for some of this. On the right is the letter from the governor of South Carolina to the trustees or to Oglethorpe. So they really had a lot of coverage. And because of the charity aspect of the Georgia colony, the London churches raised money quite a bit in the trustees' minutes. There are pages and pages in the financial reports of how many different people made donations. Wealthy people, of course, just all kind of folks in the churches. And so that's why the trustees were very big on making a go of this, because everybody was behind the colony. And this is just one church, St. George's Church, Hanover Square. A whole year later, 1734, they were devoting their sermon and their collection to the Georgia Project. The ethnic diversity of the Georgia colony. I think it was important that they had the British settle first, although they were interested in the Salzburgers. In the very first trustees meeting in July of 32, they were talking about the Salzburgers. A lot of these men had been involved in trying to help the Salzburgers from, and the Salzburgers were actually German-speaking Protestants with several different points of origin, but the initial group came from Salzburg, Austria. And so they just didn't bring the Germans in first. On this first shipload, the first year, we know we had a couple of French Huguenot families. I mentioned the Jews that arrived in July of 33 without permission, but they were German and Portuguese. And when the Salzburgers arrived in March of 34, of course, they were from different points of Germany, German-speaking Europe. This is a map I found, and it just shows you the different parts. The silk merchant people that were going to do the silk grazing, the mulberry trees and the silkworms is where the green dot is in Turin, Italy. We know that's where the Amatis brothers came from because they submitted a travel voucher to be paid back by the trustees for their travel with the Amatis and Camus families from Turin, Italy to London to leave. And the Jewish people were from Germany and Portugal, but they'd been in London a while, but they were essentially Germans and Portuguese. The trustees ran the colony till 1752, 21 years was the length of the charter. I think they quit a slightly bit early. The charter did not allow Catholics, lawyers, or slaves. They met a lot of resistance. The settlers wanted to bring in slaves, of course, to help with the farming and everything. They surrendered the charter in 1732 to the king, 1752 to the king, and that's when he set up the royal colony, and we had a series of 3 different royal governors, ending with the American Revolution. One interesting adventure was when General Oglethorpe took Native Americans, including Tomochichi, back to England to meet the king. This was the notice in the newspaper in 1734. This is a picture of the trustees meeting the Indians, Native Americans from Georgia. We had a whole discussion at one of the Henry Green symposiums in Athens a few years ago about this painting, and each trustee had to pay to have their painting, their face put in. I think the artists put the bodies in, and they had to pay to have their face put on their body, and some of them were late showing up. It took a long while to get this painting put together. The original painting's at Winterthur in Delaware, which is cited at the bottom here. It's cut off on my screen. But General Oglethorpe is the one sort of right in the middle with a black robe on. And of course, Tomochichi was in the news this week because of a statue they're erecting to him here in Atlanta at the Peace Park. The newspapers around England also carried the news, so it wasn't just in London. This is from Ipswich, which is north of London in Suffolk, very close to where I was stationed. This just announces some of the material. They would repeat a lot of the news in the various papers, especially in Scotland. There are a lot of things in the Scottish papers. They were also, it wasn't just the settling, they would talk about Georgia getting organized. This is something Oglethorpe sent back to the newspaper, and this is July, it's published in August, but it's telling what happened in July of 33 in Savannah when they first gave out the land to the folks, and the different officers were certified in their post. And it's just interesting that this was all the goings on of the colony being reported back to London, so people got to know what was happening if they had an interest in it. So people were not kept in the dark. And you see some of the names of the people we researched here, that Richard Cannon, right there in the middle, the Millage guy, the son of the Millage men. Mr. Millage died in July of 33, right before the Jewish doctor arrived. Oglethorpe said some of them got into the rum at the trading post, and what they shouldn't have. They did prohibit rum later on. The part that's blackened out has happened just because of the way I copied this into the screen, but it mentions Mr. Joshua Overend, and he died in July of 33. But the sad thing is his wife was already coming over. She had already been on the ship in the early summer of 33. It took her 2 months to get there, and she arrived to find out her husband had died. So a lot of these women were left were widowed right away. And they remarried. Most of them remarried because they inherited some land from their husbands if they got there after the land was distributed, and they did the best they could. A few people went back to London, but anyway, there were a lot of hard case studies of what happened to these folks. The sources, we mentioned ancestry.com, the English Parish Register records are there. They can also be found on Find My Past, another pay-per-view site, and FamilySearch.org, which is free through the Mormons. You can go to each parish, I think, and look at some of these, and so that's where you want to go if you had to do detailed research on some of these folks. The digitized books, the colonial records of Georgia, have not only been digitized at Hathaway Trust, but they've been reprinted by the University of Georgia and digitized. So there's a lot of stuff you can look at, and you do a lot better searching on the digitized versions if you know something's in there, but it's not in the normal index, like the word newspaper. You could search for that to see if the trustees ever paid a newspaper. I use the site newspaperarchive.com on this research, but there are many other London papers and many other digitized newspaper sites, but you just never know what your search will turn up. One of the stories I've uncovered is something, if y'all are Methodists, you may have heard the story about John Wesley and his romance with Sophia Hopke, who was Thomas Causton's niece by marriage. And she had come over in the original first year with her aunt, Mrs. Causton. And she met John Wesley, 1735-ish. They had a brief romance, and it seemed to be a high point of his life. How he broke off with her, didn't marry her, and he wrote about it and had all this wrenching of the heart. Well, now I know a lot more about Sophia Hopke, but that's not going to be part of this lecture. We'll have to talk about that another day, but we know her backstory now. And what I've learned about her is it makes you wonder how she got to come over on the charity of the trustees, since she was named in several wills in London. One thing I found was an article in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine. I just found this by a Google search. It talks about the epidemic of 33, and that might be what was brought to Georgia and why some of these people died. They mention, of course, right down here that the doctor died in April the 6th of 33, the first person to die. So it shows you there's research out there, sometimes just in a Google search. So the further reading on the founding family, the founding and the families, Mary Bondurant Warren, who unfortunately died last year, she was really into this too with me, and she has a book she's put on Kindle called The Brave Adventurers, 1732-35. It's a good place to look and read more about some of these people. The Fledgling Province by Harold Davis has been out a while, but it's one of my favorite books about the founding of Georgia. Georgia Journeys was done in the 50s, but they'd taken the first settlers in just the first boat and explored all the ups and downs of their lives in Georgia. This was by Dr. Kenneth Coleman and Sarah Gober Temple. And on the right, the colonial records, this is something they just reprinted. Some of the later volumes just came out by the University of Georgia last fall, and I used those, several of those, quite extensive. You can find them at the Georgia Archive, the original printing, but these are the later printings, and it's also been digitized. So here are the questions. So what would y'all have asked? What would the trustees have asked? What would y'all have asked the settlers that came in? How old were you? Do you have a family? What's your occupation? Do you have any debts? How will you benefit the colony? Do you have any other skills? I think some of these people had to be had more leadership skills. Like you might be a insurance agent today, but you could also be the Sunday school chairman, and you could have other skills that your job title may not show that. So a lot of these people at Georgia certainly had other skills and other things they did in Georgia besides whatever they put on the boat when they came over. Does your wife have any skills that might be useful to the colony? How soon can you be ready? Of course, you better tell them you're a Protestant, or you'll certainly not be coming to Georgia. Do you have any servants? Now, I don't know how you can be worthy poor and qualify in that category and have servants. That's what I haven't found the answer to that one. Can you pay your own way? And if you do that, the trustees would move you over to the second category, and you could pay your own way and come if you wanted to. They weren't going to pay your way if you had any money. And do you have any farming, planting, or gardening skills? So when we get to the Q&A, y'all might have another couple of questions. Of the credits, Mary Bondurant Warren, who again passed away last year, and her estate have been most helpful in encouraging me on this. Ferris Cadle of the Savannah area is very much into General Oglethorpe and his goings on in Savannah and in London. And of course, we want to thank the Earl of Egmont, because without what his record keeping in the 1700s, we wouldn't know any of this material. We're just real lucky that he was on the team for the Georgia project. And I just want to have a disclaimer here, because this is going on YouTube, that all this material is for educational purposes only, not for publication elsewhere. All rights remain with the original creators of the documentation. Last thing, I just learned when I went to a coin store the other day that in 2019, the United States government issued a $1 coin honoring the trustees' garden. I thought that was really interesting. I don't think anybody's ever seen this anywhere unless you are a coin collector. So that is the end of the talk. We got about 15 minutes for questions. Penny, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Hi, Ken, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, okay, we do have some questions. Is the Tondi you mentioned, who was an original settler, related to the owner of Tondi's Tavern in Savannah?
Yes, that was the son. You need to look at the book that Carl Weeks wrote about the Tondis. The son that came over, the second son, became the Revolutionary era Tondi's Tavern. I think he actually died in the beginning of the Revolution, so it really was run by the family. It's the same people. And the name was spelled a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's spelled Tondu. It's got a lot of odd spellings. That makes it hard to look for.
Right.
But the actual father, Tondi, that came with him, Peter Tondi Sr., he died right away. And the two boys had to be raised by other members of the colony.
Okay. What was the most surprising thing about the early settlers you uncovered in your research?
I think to me it was the fact that they had servants, because I don't understand how you can qualify as poor if you have servants. So I think we've got to understand more about what and maybe people have researches, I just don't know myself, but I think you have to understand that relationship. But I know that some people, like the Tondis, were going to come over as servants, and the man that was going to bring them over quit. He reneged, and they had to scrape up the money to more or less pay their own way.
Yeah. Phyllis asked, would you be able to get a copy of your slide?
No. I'm not sharing this. It's going to be on YouTube. Y'all can look at it there, but I'm not sharing this with anybody. I'm sorry, but this research I've done, and I don't have permission to use any of this stuff from any of the sources. So that's the caveat I'm putting on this.
Okay. Was Horn's Tavern a favorite place for politicians to visit?
I have no idea. But you could there are probably ads in the London paper, because a lot of these taverns are advertised in the paper. It depends on which paper.
Yeah. Okay. Were the indentured servants, given land after they finished the time of their contract? Yes.
And we don't know if they were called indentured in Georgia or not, but that's sort of what the situation was. They got 25 acres.
Okay.
And so some of them, as soon as they finished whatever they had to do, they were given 25 acres.
Okay, it says, please repeat what you said about Daniel Thibault and Marie Magdalene Foy.
That article is just an article I found online. They were a Huguenot family, and the Huguenot group in London has researched them. That's where that article came from. And they're descendants in Georgia. A man wrote me years ago, probably 40 years ago now, a Thibault from Albany, Georgia. There's a man down there that the Thibault family has descendants that are. There are not many families on the first ship that are identified as having descendants today, but the Thibault family is one of them. They spell Thibault several different ways, but there are descendants.
Yeah. Who is paying the way of the Jewish settlers who came without permission?
Well, they had to pay their own way. They paid their own way, hired their own ship. Of course, there were 42. There was more people on the ship than just them. So you got to realize there was a shipload of people and only 42 of them were Jewish, and they're the ones that got delivered to Savannah. So I think the captain of the ship may have been there before, but at any rate, they were delivered on their own expense.
If Dr. Nunez were not with the first Jewish settlers, do you think they would have been denied entrance?
They surely wouldn't have had as much trump card, so to speak, to be allowed in. I'm actually going to a lecture this on the 19th about this. There's a professor that's going to speak about the Jewish immigration to Georgia, but I did interview a friend of mine who is a descendant of the Sheftals, who now live in Columbus, Georgia, that descend directly from the first load of Jewish settlers. And I know that he's given talks on this before, and he just talked about how furious the trustees were. But of course, they didn't have email, they didn't call up and ask. So Oglethorpe was in a real quandary. And supposedly he took the Georgia charter, copy of it, with him to South Carolina and talked to some lawyers before he was allowed. But see, the main crux was the Jewish were not Catholic, and the charter just prohibited Catholic. It didn't prohibit anybody else. So as long as you weren't Catholic, you were okay.
Do you know if a rabbi came with the Jewish settlers?
They did form a synagogue right away. It's still there in Savannah, so I guess there was, but I don't know for sure.
Yeah. We have a question. Where is Horn's Tavern in relationship to St. Margaret?
It must be within walking distance. The trustees were not young men, so it couldn't have been very far. I'll have to find that out for the next lecture, where it was, because I don't really know.
Are you going to create a presentation on Sophia Hopkins?
Yes.
Let's see. Are there any records of people who were denied by the trustees in the vetting process?
There are bits and pieces. There's between what the trustees kept in their own minutes that we now have in print. Some people were very desperate, and the trustees turned them down, saying, "You're just too desperate. We can't get there that fast." So there were a few people like that. They mostly just said that the byline in the trustees' minutes was, today we interviewed a number of settlers and we put some of them on the list. So apparently they approved some people. They don't say how many people came in. They don't give him the names that I found, at least in the minutes, they don't do that. But every now and then somebody would come in on their own. And if somebody came in on their own and they interviewed them for whatever reason, then that person, his name is in there. And so they might tell you why they pleaded their case. But there are a few that were denied just from being too poor, too desperate, I guess, to be too desperate to be taken care of that.
Well, Ken, I don't see any other questions. Oh, here we go. Here we go. I have DNA showing up in London. What is your suggestion to best search ancestry?
Well, you've got to remember that the records on ancestry of the London parishes, like I said, are just the birth, marriages, and burials. But there are 3 different websites as part of Ancestry. So you've got to be very careful that at least you take notes of which the title of the actual, I'm calling it a website. That's how you do it as a footnote, because I had printed out everything I found so that I can go back to it. I worked on another project and they changed the name of the website or the dates it covered, so the citation had to be updated. So you got to be very careful that when you can search on answer just London, births in England, or births in London, and all, but whenever you find it, you need to make sure you printed it out so you know the actual name of that website in case they change it again. There could be other records of the British churches that are not online. I'm sure there are plenty of them. I don't know, and there may be at other websites, but that's how I found that. Just be very careful that you know the dates of the site you're looking at.
We have one more question. I've read that the Jewish travelers were from the Iberian Peninsula. Any chance some of them were from Spain?
I'm not an expert on that. There are plenty of things that have been written about it, but I've been told they were from Portugal, which is still the Iberian Peninsula, but they were Portuguese and not Spanish, but who knows? I'm just saying there are lots of literature out there, and I'm not the expert on that by any means. And again, after I hear this talk on next Saturday night, the 19th, I'll know more. So you can email me after that, and I'll tell you what he tells us. He's a local professor. Mark Bauman is going to be speaking, and it's a private group meeting, but I'm sure we'll learn a lot by listening to that, especially after what my questions have been today.
Well, thank you, Ken. People can email you if they have any questions.
Just email me through my website, kenthomasongenealogy.com.
Okay.
It's at the bottom of my column every week, too.
Okay. And it's a good column to read. Thank you, Ken.
It's been fun.
Get this.
We're going. Is that it?
It was an absolutely fascinating presentation. Next week, it will be on YouTube, so you can enjoy it again, or let your friends and family know that this is just a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much, Ken. This was wonderful. To tell you what's coming up, we will not have a virtual March Luncheon and Webinar presentation. However, a program will be uploaded to our YouTube channel on Friday, March the 11th at noon. The title is From Racetrack to Runway, How the Coca-Cola Canvas Gave Atlanta its Airport by Sarah Butler. Sarah is an Atlanta-based writer and digital marketer who's been researching the fascinating life of Coca-Cola's forgotten son, Buddy Candler, since 2017. Also, be aware that on March the 25th is our fourth Friday from the archives, where staff from reference will give this virtual webinar presentation. Just go to our website closer to the date for information on the topic and the link to register. Once again, Ken, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for joining us. Bye.